Hello, friend. Thanks for your support. Last part is here. Let's start the final part of the episode. What they built was never just a movement. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. The real revolution was not written in laws or headlines, not captured fully by cameras or courtroom transcripts. It lived in something less visible but infinitely more powerful, the echo. The way their truth traveled beyond them. The way their breaking point became someone else's direction. The way pain, once buried and silenced, transformed into a map for those still searching for a way out. 3 women, once dismissed, doubted, and discarded in front of the world, had become something entirely different. Not symbols. Not victims. Architects. Builders of something that didn't just survive scrutiny, it multiplied because of it. And as they stepped out into the night beyond the center, the sky above them softened, stars shimmering like a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had endured to get here. Christine turned back one last time. Not with regret. Not with longing. But with completion. There was no weight left in the goodbye, only closure. Because this moment, this transition, was not an ending. It was a shift. A crossing point where what they had started no longer needed them in the same way. Session 17 had never been just a continuation. It had been the pivot, the moment where survivors stopped merely surviving and began teaching, shaping, guiding. Where those who once needed saving became the very foundation others would stand on. And now, something even bigger was beginning. Session 18 didn't open with familiar voices. It didn't begin with Christine, Angela, or Robyn. It began with someone new. A girl. 17 years old. Standing in the center of a worn church basement, gripping a microphone with both hands as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Her name was Imani. Her voice trembled not from weakness, but from the weight of everything she had carried in silence for far too long. Around her sat a room filled with teenagers. Some curious, some guarded, some skeptical, all listening. And when she finally spoke, the room changed. They told us obedience was godliness, she said, her voice shaking but unbreaking. They told us silence was safety. A pause. Then, stronger, they lied. No one interrupted. No one shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed. Because truth, real truth, doesn't need volume to command attention. It has its own gravity. And in that moment, everyone in that room felt it. This was the next chapter. Not written by those who started the fire, but by those who inherited the light. Because what had begun as a fight for survival had become something else entirely. It had become a transfer of power. A passing of awareness. A ripple effect that no longer depended on its origin. Imani had watched everything. Every session. Every story. She had studied their words the way others studied textbooks. Christine's reflections. Angela's legal breakdowns. Robyn's visual storytelling. She absorbed it all not as a spectator, but as someone preparing for her turn. And now she wasn't just learning. She was leading. And she wasn't alone. Across cities, across countries, across cultures, young women were rising. Not because they were instructed to. Not because they were waiting for permission. But because they were done waiting altogether. Done hoping for change. Done asking for space. They were taking it. And they called it something new. The rising. It wasn't polished. It wasn't curated for approval. It wasn't shaped for media consumption. It was raw. Immediate. Unfiltered. And it moved. The first thing they did was something no one expected. Not a protest. Not a march. But a global digital summit. Broadcast across 5 countries. 50 speakers. Every single one under the age of 25. But what made it powerful wasn't the scale. It was the shift in language. They didn't talk about what had been done to them. They talked about what they were doing now. The opening panel was called Our Voices, Our Laws. A 19-year-old named Layla stepped forward and broke down legal systems in a way most adults couldn't. She translated complex legislation into plain truth and ended with a sentence that landed like a verdict. If you don't understand your rights, you don't have any. The next segment shifted tone but not intensity. A poet from Nigeria took the stage. No notes, no script, just presence. Her piece was titled Not Your Bride. And when she reached the final line, the silence in the room became something sacred. My body is not a dowry. It's a dynasty. Thousands watched. Some cried. Some wrote. Some, for the first time, understood. Far away, Robyn sat alone, watching it unfold. Tears fell, but not from grief. From something she hadn't expected to feel so strongly. Pride. Angela, ever analytical, was already taking notes, capturing phrases, ideas, frameworks, ready to integrate them into legal arguments, into policy drafts, into something that could outlive even this moment. And Christine, she simply whispered, "They're louder than we ever were." And that was exactly the point. This was never meant to be led forever. It was meant to ignite and then release. The shift wasn't sudden. It didn't arrive like a storm crashing through the doors of power. It moved differently, quieter, steadier, more deliberate. Like roots pushing through concrete. Like light finding its way into rooms that had been closed for generations. The rising began as a spark, but it didn't stay small for long. Momentum built not through spectacle, but through connection. One voice reached another. One story unlocked 100 more. And what started as a youth-led initiative quickly evolved into something far more structured, far more intentional, an ecosystem of change that refused to mirror the rigid systems it was replacing. They didn't recreate hierarchy. They redefined it. Leadership was no longer about control. It became about access, about amplification, about making sure no voice had to fight to be heard the way theirs once did. Within months, the Phoenix Center transformed alongside them. What had once been a place of recovery expanded into something far more dynamic, a living, breathing hub of leadership. Entire wings were redesigned to support youth-led programs. Internship pathways opened for survivors under 30. A global speaker network formed almost overnight, made up entirely of those who had once been told they were too broken, too emotional, too much. Now, they were the experts. And people listened. A publication followed, written, edited, and produced entirely by young survivors. No filters. No external framing. Just truth in its rawest, most unapologetic form. When the first issue launched, no one expected what happened next. It sold out in 20 minutes. Not because of marketing. Not because of hype. Because people were ready. Ready to hear voices that hadn't been softened for comfort. Ready to face realities that had long been ignored. Ready to see strength not as perfection, but as persistence. Inside those pages were stories that had never been told out loud before. Girls who had spent years shrinking themselves now taking up space in ink and language. One essay began with a single line that quickly spread beyond the publication, beyond the center, beyond borders. I was afraid. Now I'm free. It appeared everywhere after that, on posters, on walls, in classrooms, in whispered conversations between friends who finally had the words to name what they had lived through. And the world didn't just notice. It responded. Schools began reaching out, not to invite survivors as guests, but as authorities. The shift in framing was subtle, but it changed everything. These young women weren't being asked to share their pain for inspiration. They were being asked to teach. And they did. They taught about patterns, about manipulation, about the language of control hidden inside everyday interactions. They broke down concepts like coercion and emotional abuse in ways that made them impossible to ignore. And slowly, the script began to flip. One of the most powerful voices to emerge during this time was Nora. At 12 years old, she had been one of the many rescued through the second chapter hotline. Quiet, overlooked, invisible in the way so many children in broken systems become. At 18, she stood at the center of one of the most critical operations within the movement, coordinating the development of safe houses across rural regions where resources had once been non-existent. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. I used to be the girl no one noticed, she said during a national conference, standing on a stage that once would have terrified her. Now I'm the woman everyone hears. Beside her stood Christine. There was no sense of ownership in her expression, no lingering attachment to leadership, only something softer, something deeper, pride without possession. I'm not passing a torch, Christine said when asked about the next generation. I'm watching it multiply. Nora turned slightly toward her, her voice steady. You showed me how to hold it without burning. That exchange traveled far beyond that stage. It became a defining moment, not because of its symbolism, but because of its truth. Leadership, as they had reimagined it, was not about endurance. It was about sustainability, about ensuring that no one carried the weight alone. And that philosophy expanded globally faster than anyone anticipated. After returning from an international summit in Sweden, Angela brought back more than just notes and connections. She brought back an idea, one that would push the Rising beyond awareness and into direct policy influence. A global youth legal summit. Most assumed it would take years to organize. The Rising made it happen in months. Delegates from over 30 countries joined virtually. Different languages, different legal systems, different cultural frameworks. But one shared objective, to create something that didn't just respond to harm, but prevented it. They debated, drafted, refined, and what emerged was something no one could dismiss. A 10-point legislative framework they called the Voice Act. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't theoretical. It was precise, actionable, built from lived experience translated into legal structure. It addressed gaps most systems had never acknowledged: psychological coercion, financial entrapment, emotional manipulation that left no visible marks but caused irreversible damage. When it was presented, the reaction was immediate. 3 countries submitted it for formal review within weeks. Robyn didn't respond with a speech. She responded the way she always had through creation. On the outer wall of the new campus, she painted a mural. A phoenix rising not from flames, but from ink and paper. Each point of the Voice Act written in a different language, wrapping around the image like a promise made visible. Students gathered there daily, some taking photos, some tracing the words with their fingers, some simply standing in silence, letting the meaning settle. And one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A group of young boys visited the campus as part of a school program. They stood in front of the mural, reading quietly. One of them spoke. I used to think control was love, he said, almost to himself. Now I know it's fear. No one prompted him. No one corrected him. He had understood. That same evening, he went home and told his sister something she had needed to hear for far too long, that she didn't have to stay with the man who was hurting her. She left. She called the hotline. She found safety. A month later, she became a mentor for others. And that was how it worked. Not always in grand, visible transformations, but in quiet decisions. In conversations that shifted direction. In moments where someone chose something different than what they had been taught to accept. The Rising expanded into cities across the world: Detroit, Seoul, Cape Town, Sydney. Different landscapes, different challenges, but the same foundation. Not rescue. Empowerment. Not dependency. Autonomy. The original founders watched it all unfold, not with nostalgia, not with a need to reclaim space, but with something closer to awe. Because this was what they had hoped for. Not recognition. Replication. In a letter shared internally, Robyn wrote, I used to think our story would end when we stepped away. Now I understand it was never meant to end. It was meant to grow. Angela, in her journal, captured it differently. They are bolder than we ever were. Because they were built from our honesty, not our fear. And Christine, always the simplest in her expression, sent a message to the youth leaders that would go on to define an entire phase of the movement. Thank you for proving that what we built was real. Because only something real can survive without us. The response came from one of the youngest members. It's not that we don't need you. It's that you taught us how to need ourselves first. That line spread faster than anything before it. It appeared on shirts, posters, social feeds, tattoos etched into skin as permanent reminders of something that could never be taken again: self-ownership. And on the anniversary of the Rising's launch, they did something that no one could ignore. A 24-hour global live stream. Stories, art, policy discussions, live support lines running in real time. Over 12 million people tuned in. More than 40,000 reached out for help. Every single one received a response. No one was left waiting. Inside the youth wing, Robyn unveiled a new painting titled Inherited. It hung at the center of the space, surrounded by handwritten notes from survivors, some as young as 13. One read, "I thought I was broken. I was just waiting to be believed." Another, "You gave me the words. I gave them to my sister." And another, written in uneven handwriting but unmistakable strength, "I'm still scared. But now I'm not silent." That was the heartbeat of this chapter. Not perfection. Not resolution. Voice. Shared. Multiplied. Unstoppable. And when a journalist asked Christine what surprised her most about everything the Rising had become, she didn't hesitate. "They took what we built," she said, "and made it braver." By the time session 19 began, something fundamental had shifted, not just within the movement, but within the world around it. What had once been dismissed as personal stories, isolated experiences, or emotional testimonies had evolved into something undeniable. A framework. A language. A system of understanding that institutions could no longer ignore. This was no longer about awareness. It was about transformation. The resonance they had created, quiet at first, almost imperceptible, had grown into a steady rhythm pulsing through communities, classrooms, courtrooms, and governments. Systems that once dismissed women's voices were now quoting them. Policies were being rewritten using their language. Educational programs were being reshaped using their models. Not out of obligation, but because it worked. Because the data supported it. Because the outcomes proved it. Because ignoring it was no longer an option. The Phoenix Center had become something far beyond its physical space. It was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a blueprint. Replicated across 15 countries and still expanding, each version adapted to its culture but rooted in the same core truth: healing and power could coexist. And while the names Robyn, Angela, and Christine were still spoken with deep respect, something even more important had happened. They were no longer the center. Thousands of new names had filled the space. Women who had once been invisible were now shaping policy. Survivors had become social workers, educators, lawmakers, artists, innovators. Teenagers who once sat in silence were now standing at podiums, teaching others how to recognize the very systems that had once trapped them. Each voice carried the story forward, but none of them carried it the same way. And that was what made it unstoppable. It wasn't uniform. It was alive. One morning, Robyn received a phone call that brought everything into focus in a way nothing else had. The voice on the other end belonged to someone she hadn't spoken to in over 15 years, a woman who had once lived across the street from her. Back then, their interactions had been brief, polite, surface level, the kind of neighborly exchanges that never touched what was really happening beneath. "I used to look at your life," the woman said softly, "and think I wanted it." A pause. "I was wrong. But I watched what you built, and I finally left. I'm safe now." Robyn didn't speak right away. When the call ended, she sat there holding the phone, overwhelmed not by surprise, but by realization. This hadn't just reached strangers. It had reached people who had been silently suffering in plain sight all along. People who had never said a word. People who had been closer than she ever knew. And that was when it became clear this was bigger than any story they had told. It was rewriting lives they had never even touched directly. Angela's journey had taken her across the world. In Geneva, she stood before a panel of international leaders, presenting legal frameworks that had once been dismissed as too emotional, too subjective, too difficult to quantify. Now they were being studied, adopted, integrated. After one of her sessions, a senator from France approached her, visibly shaken. "I stayed in my marriage for 22 years, she admitted quietly, because no one ever called it abuse. Not until I heard you." Angela didn't respond with statistics or policy language. She simply nodded. Because that was the point. Naming something correctly could change everything. Christine, meanwhile, had found herself in rooms filled with women from every corner of the world. Different languages, different cultures, different histories. But the same sentence echoed, again and again, "I saw myself in your story." At first, it sounded like a compliment. But over time, It became something else. A call. A responsibility. Because recognition was only the beginning. What mattered was what came after. And everywhere they looked, something was happening. In schools, girls were forming support groups, spaces where they could speak freely, learn together, and name what had once felt confusing or isolating. They used the second chapter curriculum not as a script, but as a guide. In prisons, incarcerated women were studying the Voice Act not just as law, but as a reflection of worth they had never been taught to claim. In churches, female leaders began challenging doctrines that had long gone unquestioned, replacing silence with dialogue, obedience with understanding. In hospitals, nurses quietly passed along hotline numbers during routine visits. In homes, fathers began raising their sons differently, teaching them not just strength, but empathy. Everywhere, something was shifting. Not all at once, but enough. And the stories kept coming. A mother of 5 who had once been nothing more than background in a reality show now ran her own shelter, saying, "I used to be scenery. Now I'm the architect." A trans woman who had once believed there was no place for her in the movement shared her truth. "I didn't think this was for me. Until someone looked at me and said my freedom mattered too." She never looked back. Even Robyn's art had changed. Where once her paintings had carried the weight of anger and confusion, they now held something lighter. Softer. Not naive, but healed. Her canvases didn't ignore pain. They transformed it. Angela wrote a memoir, not about what she had endured, but about what it had taken to rebuild. She titled it Legal Tender, a quiet acknowledgement that reclaiming yourself comes at a cost, but one worth paying. Christine launched a podcast, After the Fire, where survivors spoke in their own words, without interruption, without editing for comfort. One episode stood out above the rest. A woman who had left the same community Christine once belonged to said something that resonated across millions of listeners. "I didn't walk out. I broke out." The episode became the most downloaded in the network's history. Because it didn't just tell a story. It named a reality. None of this was accidental. It was the result of years of truth-telling, of choosing exposure over silence, of refusing to accept narratives that diminished what they had lived through. And one day, a letter arrived that brought everything full circle. It was from a woman in her 80s. "I stayed silent for 62 years, she wrote. "And then one night, I heard your story. I told mine for the first time. Now I sleep." Robyn read the letter aloud in the garden. No one spoke afterward. Because there was nothing to add. It was never too late. And it was never too early. Angela updated the Voice Act to include protections for elder abuse. Christine began working with retirement communities, teaching staff how to recognize emotional trauma in older populations. The work didn't slow down. It expanded. A decade after everything began, a documentary follow-up was released, Aftershock. It revisited survivors from the early days of the movement, where they were now, what they had built. The results were staggering. One woman had started a cooperative in Kenya. Another had become a member of parliament in New Zealand. One had fostered over 30 girls. Another had created an AI system that translated trauma responses into structured legal language for courtrooms. The film didn't just receive awards. It changed laws. 3 countries introduced legislative reforms within 6 months of its release. At the premiere, Robyn stood quietly in the back, holding Angela and Christine's hands. "I don't need the spotlight anymore," she whispered. "This is enough." Angela smiled. "We were never the story," she said. "We were the spark." Christine looked out at the crowd, at the faces, the voices, the lives that had grown from something once so fragile. "And now," she said softly, "they're the wildfire." And in that moment, they understood something fully for the first time. They were no longer leading. They were witnessing. And there was something deeply sacred about that. Because true leadership had never been about staying in control. It had been about building something that didn't need them to survive. Later that year, an international resolution was passed, modeled in part after Angela's frameworks. Its title carried weight: Global Protection Against Psychological Enslavement. But what mattered most wasn't the title. It was the words that opened it. A line written by survivors. We are not fragile. We are forged. Those words spread faster than anything before. Printed in textbooks, carved into memorials, woven into fabric, inked onto skin, spoken at graduations, at weddings, in shelters, in courtrooms. Every time someone chose themselves, really chose themselves, they carried that line forward. Because it wasn't just a sentence. It was truth. Years passed. Robyn spent more time with her grandchildren, painting skies instead of storms. Angela taught, mentored, guided young lawyers who would go even further than she had. Christine traveled, hosting retreats with Nora and others, creating spaces where healing and leadership existed side by side. And whenever someone asked them how it all happened, how something born from pain had become something so vast, they gave the same answer. We didn't escape, they said. We exposed. And that exposure became a mirror. And that mirror became a map. And that map led people to freedom. Session 20 didn't arrive like an ending. It arrived like a beginning. There was no final speech. No dramatic closing. Just sunrise over the mountains. Light spilling gently across the porch where the three of them sat together. Not speaking. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything had already been said. And now it was time to listen. Around them, the center was alive. Footsteps in the halls. Laughter from the kitchen. Music drifting from another room. Voices, so many voices, continuing the work, building something even bigger. And for the first time in years, there was no tension in the air. No waiting for the next collapse. Only movement. Robyn exhaled slowly. It feels like we've handed the world the key, she said. Angela smiled. And they're unlocking things we never imagined. Christine looked out toward the horizon. And they're not asking for permission. That was the final shift. They were no longer needed. But they were still cherished. They had become the roots. And that was enough. Later that day, a small ceremony was held. No cameras. No press. Just people. The new Global Leadership Institute was dedicated, not in their honor alone, but in recognition of everyone who had carried the work forward. The plaque was simple. No titles. No achievements. Just one line, for the ones who stayed. A young girl stepped forward. No older than 12. I don't remember the show, she said. I don't know the court case. I only know that when I got here. I stopped being afraid. No applause followed. Just stillness. Because that was the real ending. Not noise. Peace. That night, they sat together one last time. By the fire. Remembering. Not the headlines. Not the battles. But the moments in between. Remember when we thought no one would believe us? Angela said. Remember when we couldn't even say the word out loud? Christine added. Robyn nodded. And now look. They didn't look at the walls. Or the awards. They looked at the lives. The ripple. The endless continuation of something they could no longer measure. The world is different, Angela said quietly. Because we told the truth. And because we didn't stop, Christine added. Robyn smiled softly. And because we chose ourselves. The fire burned low. Steady. No longer wild. And before they left, Robyn placed one final painting on the wall. 3 women. Standing at the edge of a cliff. Looking out over a world reborn. Beneath it, written in gold, we were never just wives. We were the storm that changed everything. And somewhere beyond that moment, beyond them, the world kept moving. The center kept growing. The voices kept rising. And the silence never returned. Final part is over. Thanks for watching this video. Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell and the next video on your screen.